Good evening. Welcome to today's event about the Jews in Iran. My name is Sarah. I'm a blogger at the Turban Times where I cover Libya.
Hello, my name is Masi Sadat. I am the chief editor of the Turban Times.
Before we start with the speech or lecture, we're going to give you a brief introduction. The event is hosted by NASIM and the Turban Times. Just a brief introduction about the Turban Times. It's a web magazine founded in 2016, and it's driven by different young storytellers. We're based in North African region and Middle Eastern and also Europe. What it aims to do is give a different perspective on the media in the Middle East and the North African region, rather than the usual war and conflict concentrated. So a more humanized and nuanced version of the news. And NASIM is a network of different academics and students and others who are interested in the Middle East. And what their main goal is to provide a nuanced perspective of the Middle East. And they do that. They host a variety of different events. Yeah, and that's pretty much it about NASIM.
So today's event is a part of an event series called Jews of the Middle East, or Jews in the Middle East. There's been some discussions on that choice of name. It was initiated by NASIM. We have some NASIM people that service it around the room. It was initiated and it was launched in 2017 with the initial event focusing on Jews of Baghdad. We had Linda Menouin from Jerusalem, if some of you know her, titled Anna Frank from Baghdad. And the second event focused on medieval Egypt. Tonight's event is focusing on the Jews of Iran. In my personal opinion, this is the most interesting part of this event series. It's important for many reasons, I would say, with the growing reports of growing anti-Semitism in Europe. I think it makes it even more relevant and interesting for those of us here in Denmark. So we are very honored to have Lior with us and his brother Dori, who also joined us. This is the first time in Scandinavia. Last time we went out for dinner and they approved of falafel and hummus, so that's a great step. So please give Lior a warm welcome, and the word is now yours.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming this evening. I know that it's a busy time of the semester and it's so dark outside and, and it's only 5 p.m. So thank you so much. And I really cannot thank enough Masir and Lotte for the very warm welcome they extend to us. And I want to thank the Turban Times and NASIM for organizing this event. This has been fantastic. This book has taken me to great places. It hasn't taken me to Iran yet, but it brought me to Copenhagen, and it's not bad at all. When publicity about this book started to appear, it garnered attention, and I told my wife that I was very happy that it gets all the attention before it's been published, because I'm not sure that people will have the same reaction after they will have read it. The thing is that there's something very sensitive politically about talking about Jews in the Middle East. Talking about Jews in the Middle East, it's always very charged because the Israel-Palestine conflict is in the background, and the very complex histories of Jews in the Middle East is always in the background, and it's very hard to get enough time to dismantle these issues and to give them the proper attention. And now there's this, I think that we as community are ready for longer a more nuanced conversation, as Masih said earlier, more nuanced conversation about Jews in the Middle East, but also minorities in the Middle East. And Rasmus here, my dear friend, has written extensively about minorities in Iran. So let's talk about the Jews as a prism to understanding the Iranian society, not just the Jewish community. And I hope that we will be able to open up the topic for conversation rather than, I'm not going to give you spoilers about the book. That you'll get it on your own. But you know what, to warm up, before we begin, let's see, by show of hands, I often get the question, what are there still?
Can you fix the mic? Can you do it? Transition? Put it down. Yeah. Okay, otherwise I have to cut them out.
All right. It's going to color. Okay. So, is it good now? Yeah. When I present my topic, I say that I study the Jewish communities of Iran, and I'm often being asked, what? Jews in Iran today? Yes, not biblical times, not Cyrus the Great, Jews in Iran today. So let's ask the question, how many Jews live in Iran today? If you think that A is the answer, B, C. We have a very educated crowd here. Well, C is the right answer. Today, the estimate is that there are between 20 to 35,000 Jews living in Iran. I first got to this specific topic, issues of Zionism in Iran, or Zionist identities in Iran, which has become very central to my work and the book project a couple of years ago, when I received an email inviting me to write a chapter for a new textbook commissioned by the Ministry of Education in Israel. And they decided to write a new textbook on the Middle East and asked me to contribute a chapter on Iran. I thought that it was great. I thought that it was a great opportunity. A new textbook was absolutely overdue. And I was happy to be given the opportunity to fix some of the misconceptions of Israelis regarding Iran. I agreed immediately and set to write my short, no more than 10 pages chapter describing the 20th century in Iran. Just imagine how easy it is to write an entire century into 10 pages. I wrote a chapter on Iran in the 20th century. I described the political revolutions, starting with the constitutional revolution of 1906, the overthrow of one monarchy in favor of another, and then overthrowing the Pahlavi monarchy in favor of establishing the Islamic Republic. I wrote about the fascinating social coalitions that led Iranians through a very turbulent century. And it's been written for Israeli high school students, some of whom are probably of Iranian descent. I added less than 2 paragraphs regarding Iranian Jews in the 20th century. One saying that many Jews supported the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh party. The other was about Jews who participated in the 1979 revolution, a topic on which I published an article in the Journal of Iranian Studies and have studied in depth. So I felt that I can write this chapter, this paragraph. The chapter was sent to reviewers. One of them is a very senior scholar of Iranian studies in Israel. Next to my 2 sections, there were very few comments overall, but next to these 2 paragraphs on the Jews, he wrote, "No!" exclamation mark. Iranian Jews in the Communist Party were too few to count. Vast majority of them were Zionist or something to that extent. And near the paragraph on Jews in the revolution, he wrote, "Jews overwhelmingly supported the Shah. Only very few of them joined the revolutionaries, and they did so only after the loss of the Shah became evident." My immediate response was mostly surprise. I thought to myself, how could he reduce the history an identity of 100,000 individuals into a single-dimensional thing in both cases. We already know that Jews were a prominent part of communist parties in other Middle Eastern countries, like Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, and others. We know that until 1948, Jews were pretty assimilated in their respective societies. And no one would make such assertion regarding Jews in other Middle Eastern countries. So why do we see it here? I was first reminded of Meir Gal's work that shows us how little we care to know about the Middle East. And it's been part of a much larger issue in the Israeli society, 50% of which comes from Middle Eastern background. In this work, we see, it's called The West and the Rest, 9 out of 400. It's from 1999. It's an Israeli high school history textbook, 400 pages. 9 are dedicated to the Middle East, not to Jews in the Middle East, to the region. The Middle East and North Africa are being summarized in 9 pages out of 400. And then I went to see in real numbers, how come we have such a shallow understanding of the Jewish-Iranian experience? That's what I found. So I went to, you students know it, WorldCat. It's the catalog that has everything that was ever published, easy to sort. So I searched Jews, Iran, history, 20th century. Returned 31 results. Many of the items there are dissertations, master's thesis, family albums, literary analysis, not even one history book. You see, many of it is self-published books. And then I went and searched Jews, history, 19th century Iran. 10 results. And actually 2 of them are really good books, history books, but only 10. When I searched the broadest term, Jews, Iran, history, it returned 390 results. Now let's compare it to other cases. Jews, Egypt history, 20th century. So I just replaced Iran for Egypt. It returned 105, not a whole lot, but 3 times more than what we had in Iran. Jews, Iraq, 20th century, 122 results. Jews, United States history, 20th century, 1,503. Jews in China. I did not know that there are Jews in China, and yet it returned 154 results. And you know, searching the obvious, I went to Jews, Germany, history, 20th century, and you got 2,794 results. So with such thin body of scholarship, there's really nothing to be surprised with the superficial understanding of the Iranian Jewish experience. So I want to provide a quick overview of history of Zionism in Iran. Zionism first came to the fore in Europe as a national movement of the European Jews. In a way, it was a reaction to the European Enlightenment and nationalism. We see the conversation in the Jewish communities regarding Zionism in the 1890s onward, and we see a movement that offered Jews decent existence in a place that would not reject them as Europe did, or even truer would you say, as Eastern Europe did. There were many paradoxes in Zionist thought that because of our short time, I cannot cover, but one of the biggest among them was that the great promise of Zionism was to allow Jews becoming fully European when they migrate out of Europe. Then we can talk about other paradoxes about Herzl and internalizing anti-Semitic stereotypes. And my favorite of all is, we don't believe in God, but he promised us this land. At this point, no leader of the nascent Zionist movement even considered the Oriental Jews as part of the future Israeli or Zionist societies. The Oriental Jews themselves, having had very different experience in the 19th and early 20th centuries, did not articulate a clear response to the political development in Europe. Moreover, the Jews of the Middle East had not undergone the process of secularization that was essential to the Zionist paradigm, and maintained the religious perception of Eretz Israel, Ottoman mandatory Palestine, the land of Israel, as the Holy Land. Jews from the Middle East and Iran immigrated in small numbers to Palestine throughout the ages, but we have to remember that the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, so travels were indeed very common, especially for pilgrimage and the economy that facilitated it. The message of political Zionism first struck chord with Jewish Iranians in 1917, following the Balfour Declaration, that came at the same time of the first disillusion Iranian Jews experienced with the outcomes of the constitutional revolution. All of a sudden, the promise of relocating to a place of their own sounded rather tempting. Iranian Jews established Zionist associations to teach Hebrew and handle the preparation for a mass exodus. However, shortly after, in 1925, with the ascendance of Reza Pahlavi as the new Shah, who overthrew the Qajar dynasty, the new national project and the vision for a new Iranian society, with almost a diminished role of religion and emphasis on ethnic identity, made the Jews shelf their plans for relocation. Reza Shah removed all the laws that barred Jews and other minorities from living in certain areas, engaged in some occupations, and joined the army, for example. Jews have now become nominally equal part of the Iranian society. Zionism remained a more clandestine, underground operation. Zionist organizations could operate openly in some fields and then were banned altogether in others. Sympathies to Zionism and different interpretations of Zionism started to split the communities in the 1930s. Shmuel Chaim, the person that we see in the photo here, the Jewish representative to the Majlis, had a harsh disagreement with another Jewish dignitary, Lokman Nahorai. While Nahorai espoused the interpretation and perhaps the practice that Jews should join full force the Zionist international organizations, Chaim believed that Zionism is overall a positive development. But Iranian Jews should fight for the rights and status in Iran and not to forfeit it for any messianic dream. Chaim published a newspaper called the Chaim, Life, in which he preached for integration efforts for the Jews, participation in political life, and developing of national consciousness. Chaim was actually executed by Reza Shah for mostly false accusation of being complicit in an attempt to assassinate him. In any case, following this incident, any non-Iranian organized movement was banned from operating in Iran. World War II changed things around once again. In 1941, the Allied armies invaded and occupied Iran and forced Reza Shah to abrogate in favor of his son Mohammad Reza, who opened the political sphere to any and every political movement, including Zionism. For the first time, Zionist organizations based in mandatory Palestine opened headquarters in Tehran and other Iranian cities to care for the needs of the Jewish Polish refugees that had arrived in Iran, but that's part of another story. In any case, after seeing the Polish refugees who fled Europe, first from the Nazis and then Stalin's Soviet Union, Iranian Jews went through a couple of stages. One, the leadership recognized the need to help their brethren over in Europe, escape Nazis first and then to help them establish national home. This obviously made the case for Zionism in Iran, and more Iranians connected to the message of Jewish redemption a la Zionism. Another thing that happened among Jews was that, like non-Jewish Iranians, they found political home in the newly formed Communist Party, the Dette. They supported it and joined it for many reasons. Communist ideology was not one of the main reasons. The main reason was the Dette party being the fiercest opposition to fascist forces in Iran and outside Iran, and the struggle for egalitarian society, something that resonated with the Iranian Jews that were still lower class, broadly speaking. Jews published communist-leaning newspapers, and some Jews were among the top ranks of the party. So here we see one of the first communist Jewish newspapers. It's called Nisan, and the other was Bnei Adam. These were important newspapers. They reached readership well beyond the Jewish community. And in fact, in times when the official communist newspapers were banned, the Jewish newspapers became the mouthpiece for the party leadership. However, we have to remember that mainstream Zionism was a socialist movement. The socialist elements of the movement were extremely dominant and extremely socialist. At around the same time of the 1940s, they established the kibbutzim in future Israel. And the kibbutzim were perhaps one of the biggest communist experiments in history. At that point, one could easily feel sympathies for the Zionist project, while at the same time being affiliated with the Iranian Communist Party and fighting alongside with the Iranian national movement against the Soviets in the north and the British in the south. Indeed, multi-hyphenated identity, such as Iranian nationalist, communist, Zionist, was not a rare sight. After the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Zionist movement could no longer be considered a non-state actor. Having discovered the terrible loss of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, 6 million that would have been the human reservoir for Israel, Israel had to find another source to make up for that loss. Again, while it was not their intention in the first place, in 1948, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion ordered to find them among the Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi is a very broad category describing Jews from the Muslim countries of the Middle East. And in the Muslim Middle East, from Morocco to Iran, from Yemen to Turkey, there were about 950,000 Jews living. The Israeli goals were to make them immigrate en masse. It worked in some of the communities for several reasons, but we see that the Yemenite community live in Yemen. Jews in Syria, Lebanon, and Libya left almost completely by 1948-49, Iraq by 1951, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt by 1956. But in Iran, the only place where Zionists could operate almost completely openly, and the population was pretty sympathetic to Zionism, the Jews did not consider Zionism to be their ideal solution. Rather, they were going through a rapid process of urbanization, of becoming an integral part of their homeland society. And global politics helped them, ironically, to make these multi-layered, nuanced identities and loyalties. In the early 1950s, Habib Levy wrote a report for the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, lamenting the loss of the entire generation that preferred leftist Iranian organization over Zionist ones. To that mix, we can add socialist Zionist political parties, especially from the kibbutzim spectrum, that sent emissaries to Iran, and they found mutual grounds themselves with Iranian socialists and communists. So there was this bond between Israeli socialist activists, thinkers, intellectuals, and the Iranian socialist communist thinkers, such as Jalal Ahmad, for example, who saw Zionism as a movement of East and West, old and new. He traveled to Israel in 1963. He stayed in Israel for 10 days. He wrote a travelogue, and it was pretty impressive to see what kind of responses he delivered to his readers. So, for example, he stayed in kibbutz Ayel Tashachar, which is in kibbutz in northern Israel, and I found in the kibbutz guest book what he and his wife, the novelist Simin Daneshvar, wrote, and I would like to read it. Regardless of the hospitality, I saw here people I've never expected to meet, learned people, understanding and open-minded. In a sense, they are implementing plateau. Honestly speaking, I always identified Israel with the kibbutz, and now I understand why. And his wife, Simin Daneshvar, wrote, as I see it, the kibbutz is the answer to the problems of all countries, including our own. Bless you. In those times, we see Zionist and Israeli involvement in Iran, in the Jewish life in Iran. Zionist clubs and youth movements were active. However, Iranian youth did not engage Zionism as Israeli officials had hoped. Indeed, Zionism had become more complex than in 1917. The 25,000 Iranian Jews that had immigrated to Israel between 1948 and 1951 were the poorest and neediest of Iranian Jewish communities. there were myriad stories at the time of Jews who had immigrated and returned, or immigrated and wanted to return. The important thing was that Iranian Jews overall had a sober idea of what was waiting them on the other side of the Zionist story, unlike other Jews from the Middle East. A telling example is given in Stanley Abramowitz, one of the JDC directors in Iran. JDC is the Jewish Distribution Committee, the biggest Jewish aid organization. He wrote in a report in 1951 of one instance of Jews from Nehevand who immigrated to Israel. And he writes, "The letters that come from Israel dampen all spirits. The Iranian Jew is not the Chalutzik, pioneer type. The ordeals of present-day life in Israel have left him discouraged, longing to return to his damp, dark ghetto room, for he has been used to that room and even liked it. Food is available in Iran, and though he earned little, he lived in an environment which was not strange to him. The language, the people, the life was familiar. Israel is not. As a Persian, he is looked down upon. The letters that come back from Iran complained about the shortage of food. Nehevand received a letter and a Torah scroll from their brethren in Israel. The Nehevand Jews in Israel signed their names on that piece of scroll, and in the accompanying letter they wrote that they took an oath by the Torah from which they sent a piece, that their brethren in Nehevand will not come to Israel now. Anyway, not until they inform them that the time is more suitable. And Nehevand is a God-forsaken place in the mountains of Loristan, cut off from the outside world. Yet the Lenchlight in Israel advised them, adjured them to remain in Nehevand. Another family is advised not to leave for Israel until their son Joseph is married. Joseph is 1 year old. Another interesting and nuanced interpretation comes from Elias Eshakian. Elias Eshakian was a teacher and principal of Alliance schools in Iran for over 25 years. He wrote in his memoir, Iran has been my homeland, Vatan, and Jerusalem has been the source of my belief in God and my Qibla. This quotation suggests yet again that many Iranian Jews had different interpretations of Zionism than the one that the Jewish Agency in Israel advanced. Eshakian was a role model for many Iranians, and it is clear that his national identity of Iranian did not interfere with his religious identity as a Jew. He proudly projected this combined identity throughout his career, which may have inspired and encouraged many of his students. Now, I want to take you back to the comment that I got on the textbook chapter about the Jews being, or Jews that had joined the revolution only when it became evident that the Shah was losing. And I want to tell you the story of 1979 and the revolution in Iran, in the Jewish community. So in March 1978, almost a full year before the Shah left Iran, in the elections to the leadership of the Jewish community, a young group of revolutionaries won the elections to the leadership of the community with the clear ideology of participating in the revolutionary effort. This group was made of it was led by two activists. One of them is Arun Yashaya and Aziz Daneshrad. They were in prison for anti-Shah activism. In prison, they came to know the leaders of the revolutionary movements. They decided to help recruit the Jewish community, and they did pretty well. They won the elections. And this was, again, almost a year before the Shah lost his position. And they published a newspaper called Tammuz, in which they tried to connect Jewish tradition, Jewish heritage, to the revolution, to the rebuilding of the new Iranian society. It was another publication that tried to connect the Jewish communities of Iran with the Jewish communities of other countries. It was highly critical of Zionism. This is, for example, a picture of the demonstrations of September 1978 in Iran. And we see in this demonstration there were 12,000 Jews in Tehran. And we estimate that at the same time the Jewish population of Tehran was about 40,000. So it means that over a quarter of the population was on the street that day. Another story is of the Jewish hospital, the Sapir Hospital in Tehran, that during the revolution was the only hospital that treated the wounded protesters without handing them later to the hands of the Savak, the Secret Service. So it became, there was an amazing operation that connected the hospital personnel and the revolutionary movement. They sent out ambulances to collect the wounded protesters from the streets and bring them to the hospital. And by the way, in the hospital, not all the doctors and the administrators were supporters of the revolution. Many of them were supporters of the Shah. Some of them were even personal friends of the Shah. But for them, being involved in this operation was not about supporting the revolution. It was about being good neighbors. It's about being part of the Iranian society. On the, well, you don't see it that well in this photo, but on the sign, on the entrance sign to the hospital, it says in Persian and Hebrew, "Ve'avta lerecha kamocha," and love thy neighbor like thyself. And this was their philosophy. This was what the entire operation was about. And then they were recognized by the administration, by the revolutionary government after the revolutionary succeeded. And I want to tell you one more story about a TV show in Iran in April 1979. It was Passover. And the first few months after the revolution were sort of, it was on the borderline between dystopia and utopia. But one of the things that was very important for some of the fragments of the revolutionary movement was to show that the new Iranian society is going to be an inclusive one, something that every Iranian will be able to find their place in the new Iranian nation. And in April, they decided to dedicate a program to Passover and to examine the revolutionary values of Passover. And they talked about how, just like the Israelites in the story of Passover, the Iranians went from dictatorship to freedom with the revolution. They talked about, well, they also compared Khomeini to Moses, but this is another story. And the two guests in the studio were Rabbi David Shofet, the son of the religious leader of the Iranian community, Rabbi Yedidia Shofet, and the second guest was Muhandes Aziz Daneshrad, who was a very prominent, I mentioned him, he was a very prominent political activist in the Jewish community. He was a communist, he served time in prison, and also he was a member of the first constitutional drafting committee after the revolution. And they invited the communist and the rabbi to talk about Passover. And before the end of the show, the host asked a very, I should say, a very explosive question. And the question was, is it true that all the Jews are Zionists? And to say something like that in April 1979, when Zionism means something very specific, which is loyalty to Israel, and this was part of the rhetoric of the revolution. To ask something like that is very charged, to say the least. And it took them a few seconds to even understand what was going on there. And Rabbi Shofet was the first to respond. And he said, "What is Zion, do you know? Zion is the biblical name of Jerusalem. Loving Zion makes me Zionist, and yes, I'm a proud Zionist, and so are all the Jews. You're a Muslim, right? You pray to Mecca, right? Does it make you a Saudi?" To say to an Iranian, to suggest that Saudi can become anything in their identity. Well, if there's a country that Iran dislikes more than Israel in the Middle East, it may well be Saudi Arabia. But this was, I think that it delivers the sentiment of how Iranian Jews, the many interpretations of Zionism for Iranian Jews. And with the delicate situation between Israel and Iran since 1979, the Jews of Iran were even more courageous to remain true to their own interpretations of Zionism and Judaism. Even after the revolution, Iranian Jews emigrated to the US and much fewer to Israel, and about 25 to 30% of the community chose to stay in Iran. They still recognize the right of Israel to exist and are interested in the goings-on in Israel. They visit Israel, and many of them have relatives there. Even when speaking in public, in the press or in the parliament, they say that the most despicable thing about Israel is not about its existence, but its refusal to become part of the Middle East, to make peace with its Arab neighbors and other issues concerning the ethnic tensions in Israel. And I want to finish by reading a very short quote from one of my favorite memoirs. It's called Journey from the Land of No. It was written by an Iranian Jewish-American author, Roya Hakakyan. And it goes, it's about Passover 1977 in Tehran. Naturally, it caused an uproar at the Seder when father asked Uncle Ardi to read the halachma. Everyone burst into laughter even before he began. He obeyed and read, but not without a touch of subversion, a bit of mischief. This is the bread of affliction, some affliction, that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. This year we are slaves. May this slavery never end. This year here, next year at home in Israel. Pardon me for not packing. The family dreamed of the land of milk and honey, but wanted to wake up in Tehran. After reciting the halachma, Uncle Ardi asked, "So, Hakakyan, are your bags packed, or is the flight to Jerusalem postponed for another year?" Father smiled and waved him away, assuming his question had been meant in jest. But Uncle Ardi, without the slightest hint at humor, pressed on, "Really, Hakakyan, why say it? Why not leave it as love thy neighbor like thyself and call off the rest?" Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lior. We will have a 20 minutes break now. You're welcome to eat some of the Iranian food, and we'll be back in 20 minutes, approximately. Thanks.
Such as Al Jazeera and Iran Wire and BBC and many more. We'll post some links in the event afterwards. So some of what he spoke about, you can read it afterwards. Thank you, Arash, and I believe Rasmus had a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. My question is, I have tons of questions, but I'll keep it to one at least, maybe two. But my question for Lior is about the support of Iranian Jews for the revolution against the Shah. You mentioned the Tammuz group. I'm interested in that exact time, so April 78, correct? And the newspapers, you showed us a couple of pictures of what kind? How did the Jewish pro-revolution group frame their support for the revolution in terms of the emerging leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini and I think it's fair to say by spring, summer 78, the dominance of Islamist groups. I know there was still plenty of socialist, communist, and many other groups involved, and the Sharik, the Fedayan, and the Mujahideen, and so on and so forth, and even the Tudeh. But how did they come to terms with the fact that the revolutionary leader at that point seemed to be an Islamic cleric?
So let me start by saying that when they were trying to pitch the idea of revolution to the Jewish community, what they said is that it's a just struggle against dictatorship, and you know, it's in 30 years later when I was talking to them, they said, when we took to the streets, we didn't go as Jews. We were Iranians. We were protesting the same dictatorship that our compatriots were struggling against. So it wasn't a Jewish issue for them. Like, they didn't try to frame it as a Jewish issue. It was us as Iranians. We have to go to the streets to protest against the dictatorship and the injustice of this government. And the person that was of the revolutionary movement that was closest to the Jewish community was Talaqani. And broadly speaking, I mean, nobody realized, and I think that you'd agree with me, that nobody realized how big the role of Khomeini is going to be eventually, especially not in '78. It looked like it's going to be maybe the return of the Jabhat Milli. It's going to be the golden age of the Tudeh. Peikar and Fedayin and all those Marxist Islamist groups were, I mean, there were Jews in the Mujahideen. There were Jews in the Fedayin. So they didn't see the characterization of an Islamist Marxist group as something that limits them from joining this group. They were proud to be a Jewish community living in a Muslim country. It wasn't something, so for them, the Islamic definition of, the Islamist definition of these groups was just another type of identification. It wasn't a religious requirement. So that was how they reconciled. And Talaqani was very important in the connection with the community, and Matin Daftari was very important. So they kept in touch with many of the people that were leaders of the different movements in the revolution, but were not, and they definitely were in touch with Khomeini as well, but not as early as 1978. Just a few weeks before Khomeini returned to Iran, there was a delegation that went to meet him in Paris of the Jewish community, and they were sure to mention that Jews were participating in the demonstration, and they wanted to make sure that he knew that they were in touch with revolutionary leaders.
Any other questions?
I have a question, if I may. Lior, in the book you mentioned, I don't know what year it was, but that I think a poll was conducted in Israel among Jews with Iranian background on an possible attack on Iran, and I think most of them did want that attack to take place, and I think that was the first time maybe that among the Iranian Jews in Israel, or Mizrahi Jews, I don't know, where they, went against the government policies on attack on Iran. I'm not sure exactly about that, but yeah. So if you can tell more about that.
Yeah, so Iranian Jews in Israel, just like other Mizrahi Jews in Israel, are considered to be the political base of the right wing. They're very hawkish. It has some it is rooted in cultural and sociological reasons, but they are supportive of the right-wing parties from at least since the mid-70s. And in 2012, there was, if you can recall, these were the times when Prime Minister Netanyahu was trying to organize the international coalition to bomb Iran. They conducted a poll among Iranian Jews in Israel, citizens of Israel, supporters of the right-wing government in Israel. Should Israel bomb Iran? And overwhelmingly of those people were against, and then CNN sent reporter to Little Tehran in Tel Aviv. And it's a beautiful story you can find on YouTube. It's a 5-minute story of CNN. And they went into Persian restaurants and stores, and everybody has the portrait of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and the flag of Pahlavi Iran. And obviously they did not sympathize any of the elements of the Islamic Republic, but overwhelmingly they said, Iran is our home. That we cannot have our current home bomb our previous home, which is, I mean, they consider themselves Iranian. It's something that is so deeply emotional to them, this connection. And even though they were again, I cannot overemphasize how much they are considered to be the bloc of the political right-wing voters. But you have to understand, it's an opposition that emerged from within that camp. And I thought that it was very interesting and very fascinating to see how they responded to this campaign.
We have a question over there.
Hey, I just want to ask you, how did it affect the Jews in Iran when the Shah had a really close relationship to Anwar Sadat, and when Egypt had problems with Israel? How did that affect the community?
That the Shah had close relationship with the Egyptian President Sadat. I mean, I think that there's another book waiting to be written on 77 to 79. If you think about it, Egypt and Iran switched roles in 79. From the closest regional ally, Iran turned into the biggest regional enemy, and Egypt, from the biggest regional enemy, turned into the biggest ally of Israel. The Shah actually played a significant role, and it's completely forgotten role in establishing the first connections between Israel and Egypt. Much of it was done in secret, and people did not know about it, and even Iranian Jews did not know about it. They were happy, as I said, I mean, a sentiment that was very deeply rooted in the Iranian Jewish community was that Israel must become part of the region. And they were very supportive of the peace agreement, and the peace treaty was supported even by, I mean, on the pages of Tammuz, the very critical newspaper of the Jewish community after 79, they celebrated this peace treaty. So it was something that was seen as a positive development of Israel, and part of the agreement was returning of the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which was seen as something that, okay, Israel is willing to give up the territory in order to gain legitimacy in the region, and also to gain significant peace treaty. And what they were hoping is that at some point it will continue and will pursue peace treaty with other Arab countries, which, I mean, the next treaty was signed 15 years later and was very different.
Thank you. My question is about Israel itself, Iranians in Israel. Coming from there, I can say that I have not really felt the existence of Iranians as a bloc. Unlike Yemeni or Iraqi or Gruzini or whatever, you know, they have their neighborhoods, their schools, their music, their parties or whatever. But I only met one Iranian selling carpets in Jerusalem. And in one luxurious garden, I would say. So is it because they are not so many, or is it because they were well off, or is it because they are clever in integrating? Why can't one feel them in Israel? They don't shout in the Knesset or in the streets.
That's a very good question. It is a very different community in terms from the other Mizrahi communities. Part of it is because they try to distinguish themselves from the Arabs. They were not Arabs. They have community organizations, and they have had publications. I grew up in Holon, which has one of the biggest Iranian Jewish communities. There is a very big community in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. I would say that politically they acted differently than let's say the Moroccans or the Iraqis in Israel. But the first Moshe Katsav, now former president and former prisoner, was the first Iranian minister in '77. A first Iranian-born minister in the Israeli government in 1977. And he was the pride of the community for so long. I think that their integration efforts were done differently, especially during the days of the relations between Iran and Israel. They positioned themselves as a community that really could really become a bridge, actually, between Iran and Israel, or Israel and the East and the Middle East. If you go to Holon, to Bet Koresh, you'll see a very thriving community center, and they have newspapers and publications, and they are organized. I think that it's a more close-knit community than others. They don't try to reach out to other communities in the same manner that other Mizrahi communities did.
What would you say the main reason that made them left Iran? Whether harassed, obliged to leave? I think you mentioned something about maybe they were the poorest. Was it that? I mean, was it the dream of a better life? And where does the dream of this Zionism and that vision of a better life put them, you know, in the current Israel? I mean, their life in Israel now. Sorry, and that mean that the Jews in Iran now were the rich who choose to stay? I mean, was that it?
Okay, so there are different components to the answer. In 1948 to 1951, we can certainly say that the poorest of the Jewish communities left Iran for Israel. This was, I mean, some of them because of this dream that in Israel they will be able to make some advancement, social, economical investment, but also religious, right? I mean, in the Zionist terminology, it's called aliyah, it's ascendance to Israel. You don't just immigrate, you go up. And some of them really felt that this is their chance to fulfill this messianic dream. And then from 1951, especially after 1953 onward, the numbers of Jews immigrating to Israel is extremely low. I mean, we're talking about, in 1969, Israel officially ended any attempt to bring Iranian Jews over to Israel. The reports in 1969 said the Iranian Jews are technically, should be treated as the well-off communities of the US, Australia, and South Africa. They are not going to leave. So they seized all the operations to bring Iranians over. And in 79, and this is a very important issue to tackle, in 79 it's true that the majority of the community left. By the way, only about 30% of them left for Israel. The rest left for mostly California and maybe 10 or 15% left for Europe. They left, but we should look at it again in the context of what happened in Iran in 79. Tens, hundreds of thousands of Iranians left Iran in these years. And we should look at it maybe in terms of social economic status, class that left Iran. Not the Jews were at that point, they were in the upper middle class, and they behaved sociologically like the upper middle class, went for other places. It's true that many Jews felt more vulnerable in 79 than other Muslim Iranians, but those that stayed were the group of Jews that felt that there's nothing better that they can get in other places. The revolution will, at some point, it will normalize. It will get into a routine, and things will become stable again. I've interviewed people that lived in Los Angeles for 30 years and applied for citizenship in the US only after 30 years because at that point, they realized that they're not going back to Iran. So for 30 years, they still held their Iranian passport and American green card. And only after 30 years, they decided that they are staying in the US. They came to terms with the fact that they are not going back. So even among those, people still lived on the line between other countries and Iran. Iran was always the home base.
Any other questions?
This can actually, I think, Foredrag, can you hear me? Maybe it can be a question for both of you, or you can choose who can reply. This is more related to contemporary Iran today. There is this recurrent phenomenon in Iranian public discourse about someone being a Jew, or his family being Jewish, of Jewish origin. Part of it obviously has to do with anti-Semitism, and it can be used as a way of trying to write off someone as being possibly in the pocket of the enemy and as a crypto-Zionist. But generally, I think it's also a question of the historical phenomenon of crypto-Jews, I guess. Is that the right word? Can you say something about this phenomenon? Is it only in people's minds, or is there something about it? People like, for example, Bodam Shion from the Hayat al-Mutarifeh, a prominent conservative politician. Other people I've heard this about. Even
Ahmadinejad was maybe the best example.
Yes.
When his critics tried to attack him, to discredit him from the right wing, they said that he's a crypto Jew, that his father converted to Islam and he's not a real Muslim. I think that maybe Arash, you can speak better about it, but I think that I don't think that it's seeking for the cultural roots of or the true history of people and maybe recover the crypto Jewish heritage of Mashhad or other places. I think that it's, and also I don't think that it's a very common, I mean, it has presence in the political life, but it's not something that is used, especially not during the presidency of Rouhani, which really tried to reaffirm the bond of Iran with its Jewish population.